From Springfield, this is State Week, a program of analysis and commentary on the events that made news this past week in Illinois state government and politics.
Instead of expanding the role and the power of the legislative inspector general, it's been restricted. And as a result, I just don't feel like I can be effective in this job anymore. It was supposed to be the year of big ethics reform, and I don't think that happened.
We see systemic failures over and over again. We're promised public safety, and yet Chicago sports teams have better draft records than tough on crime policies have providing us safety.
And we do have the Delta variant that is rising across the nation, across the world. So don't think that we're entirely through this yet.
That's Governor J.B. Pritzker issuing a warning the pandemic is still ongoing. Also, Senator Robert Peters, as the governor signed more criminal justice reform measures this week. And you heard the Illinois Legislative Inspector General Carol Pope, who has stepped down, and also criticized state leaders when it comes to enacting ethics changes. We'll talk about that and more coming up on State Week. I'm Sean Crawford in Springfield, and our panel today includes Charlie Wheeler, emeritus professor and former director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at the University of Illinois Springfield. Charlie has also been a longtime State House reporter and observer. Also with us, Hannah Meisel, NPR Illinois State House editor, and joining us today, Jerry Nowicki with Capital News Illinois. And Jerry, it's always good to have you on with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sean.
And Jerry, I'll start with you because you covered this. The governor took some action on legislation this week. We know there was a major package that the Legislative Black Caucus pushed through earlier in the year. Does some of what was signed this week build on that, and what exactly is changing?
Yeah, so the big one there is the measure that bans deceptive police interrogation of minors. It really struck me the emotion and the people whose there were a number of exonerees there that had been imprisoned wrongfully for false confessions or whatever, some of that due to the deceptive practices of police. And the emotion level was very high for some of the people who spoke there. Terrell Swift of the Inglewood Four, who when he was 17 confessed to a rape and murder basically because of the practices police used, and was exonerated by DNA evidence in 2011. He said this could have changed his life had this been in place because the crux of that bill is that any testimony obtained through or a confession obtained through deceptive practices wouldn't be permissible in court. So, and then there's other ones that the governor signed that allows the state's attorney to petition the court for shortening a sentence if a long sentence for whatever type of crime no longer is in the interest of justice per the bill. And then there were a couple other ones, I think, too. One of them creating a task force in that regard, just to look at other measures that might allow for resentencing in the interest of justice. Another measure aims to encourage restorative justice by creating a privilege for anything said in restorative justice courts, which have been in use since 2017 in Illinois.
So, Jerry, going back to deceptive interrogation, and I believe we're the first state, from what I read, in the country to enact such a law. This is what we have, a lot of us probably have seen on television in some cases where I'm guessing that the officer, detective may say, we've got a witness who saw you there or something like that when they really don't. But what is law enforcement's response to this, Ben?
The bill actually passed unanimously, and when Rep. Justin Slaughter, who was the House sponsor of it, was speaking at the bill signing event, he said, we were surprised by the number of law enforcement groups. I think he said the chiefs of police were in support of it. So this was not a very controversial bill. I think even Leader Jim Durkin, a Republican from Western Springs, the House minority leader, he got up there on the floor and said, this is something that we need to do. We need that level of trust in law enforcement.
Charlie, your thoughts on this legislation? This is a state that has had a lot of, really a poor record when it comes to wrongful convictions. A lot of states have that poor record. Some of that goes back to problems with torture. We remember that, and the scandals that have occurred. What do you think of this law, and is this a step in the right direction?
Yeah, I think it is. The notion that a young kid, and if you're 16, 17 years old, you're not an adult. You may think that you're very mature, but in fact, you're not. And so you're sitting there's a bunch of police detectives haranguing you, and they tell you lies. Well, you know, your brother said that he was with you when you did it. And if you admit it, you can go home and play your video game, that kind of stuff. This is really a step in the right direction. And as you said, we've got a horrendous record in terms of people being wrongly convicted. There's the torture, the infamous John Burge, a Chicago police officer, the case of jailhouse informants. This comes at a time when a man named Anthony Porter passed away this week. Anthony Porter was the first big case of wrongful conviction that kind of brought this issue to people's attention. He was just a short time away from being executed when his attorneys got a stay on the basis that he was not mentally competent to understand what was going to happen to him. While the stay was playing out, a group of Innocence Project folks from Northwestern University found the real murderer and got him to confess. And so that really highlighted the wrongful conviction instances that have been going on. And in the case of this law that we're talking about now, dealing with false confessions, a law professor at Northwestern pointed out there have been at least 100 recorded wrongful convictions based on false confessions, including 31 cases in which a child falsely confessed. So I think this is a step in the right direction. This builds upon the package that passed earlier this year. And as was noted earlier, the law and the accompanying measures that Governor Pritzker signed earlier this week had little or no opposition, and basically no opposition even from law enforcement groups. These are the same people who are very critical of the earlier package. So I think, to sum it all up, we're moving in the right direction. There's more work to be done, but at least we're going in the right direction.
Well, the governor taking that action this week. And then, Hannah, let me move on, because the administration also made an announcement that's something a lot of people have been waiting for, a lottery coming up for marijuana dispensary licenses. This has been delayed. We've talked about that before, but what do you take away from the fact? What does it mean that this lottery and these dates have been now established?
This means that after more than a year and a half that marijuana has been legalized for recreational use in Illinois, finally, the folks who spent a lot of money on dispensary license applications early last year, these so-called social equity license applicants can finally get some closure on whether or not they are going to be able to move forward with a dispensary business. The law was passed, 2 years ago, more than that, and, it was promised to be equity-centric. And, for a lot of people, the delay on getting these licenses out the door has really muddied that goal. And so, finally, the state can make it right. But there was a lot of issues with that initial law and how the applications were scored. And a lot of people were not happy about it.
Let me move on to another thing that happened this week, and Hannah, you covered this as well. The Legislative Inspector General Carol Pope, she's a former judge, was in the role of what's really an ethics watchdog for the General Assembly. She painted a not-so-flattering portrait of policymakers when she stepped down this week. What were her complaints?
Right. Legislative Inspector General Carol Pope, she issued a letter to lawmakers this week saying, basically, I'm done. I'm calling it quits. She had been pretty vocal about what she saw as the limitations of her office and, the powers that statutes gave her, to actually investigate claims of wrongdoing and ethics violations and stuff like that. And, basically the crux of her argument, what she told me that she, figured she could no longer do the job is she felt as if, one, lawmakers just didn't listen to her suggestions. And two, not only did they not listen and not give her expanded powers, they actually restricted her office in many ways. And for those reasons, she told the lawmakers, told everyone that she just couldn't do anymore.
Jerry, there was ethics legislation that was approved in the General Assembly, I believe, but from my vantage point, and I wasn't following every little detail and every movement, but I didn't get the feeling that it really was a big priority under the dome this year.
No, the fact that it came about, I forget what hour it was, but it was late in the day, and when it got to the floor, you had a lot of Republicans up there saying, this really doesn't do anything. I'm going to vote for it anyway because I can't vote against it. There are some incremental steps it takes, like conflict of interest disclosures, and yeah.
I think a couple of the things that I would consider significant reforms. One is consultants are going to have to register, and lobbyists have to disclose contractual relationships they have with consultants for the purposes of influencing legislation. And you'll recall that one of the charges leveled against Madigan's confidants was that some of his people were placed in, quote, consultant positions where they were paid money for doing little or nothing. But that was never disclosed because the lobbyist registration law did not require it at that point. So I think that's significant. And I also think the banning of fundraisers on session days or on the day before or after a session day is probably a good thing too. But the good government group said it doesn't go far enough. There were a lot of things that they wanted to see. The Inspector General obviously thought that there was not enough in there to strengthen her hand. But as I've remarked in other venues, this is an ongoing process and it's incremental, and we move little by little, little by little. So depending on how you look at it, the glass is either half full or half empty. And I guess from having watched this stuff for a long time, I like to look at it as the glass is probably half full, and drop by drop, we're moving more towards where we would like it to be.
Yeah, and Hannah, I think that's a good point Charlie made about the incremental steps. It seems to me that sometimes people come into these positions, and I don't want to say they don't know how the legislature works, but they get frustrated by the pace in which the legislature works and things get accomplished. And it does come very slowly, drip by drip in some cases. So is that part of the issue, do you think, here?
I mean, yeah, it's not just the Legislative Inspector General who has that kind of realization. It's also lawmakers themselves, especially, I've heard from a lot of folks who have been here a while, and they've noticed that some freshmen come in and from advocacy roles, and they imagine the job to be much different, and that that things will get done in snap of fingers, and it just doesn't work that way. But especially from Carol Pope was a judge before this, as you mentioned. And, one of the things that she had asked for was subpoena power. But reasonable people can disagree about whether that was a reasonable request because, do we really want the Legislative Inspector General investigating things that, a state's attorney or the U.S. attorney's office should be the ones investigating. We can debate about the nuances of things, but it is a powerful narrative that especially for folks in the Republican Party who were going to use this as fodder, that's for sure, to say that Carol Pope basically quit because she couldn't, she felt as if her power was limited by the Democrats who are in charge of state government to investigate possible cases of wrongdoing. And it's a powerful narrative also because her predecessor, Julie Porter, who was interim legislative inspector general installed in late 2017 after a period of time where there wasn't even an inspector general for 3 years. She had similar complaints, and she also put them out there into the public domain. And, so now this is 2 legislative inspector generals in a row who are, complaining in public forums that the office just isn't as powerful, and basically that lawmakers just don't want to be, investigated. Also, Tom Homer, who was the first inspector general who served in that role for, I think for like 10 years, I was reminded that he also had a report that was never published, but the Tribune got a hold of it in 2014 that kind of detailed how former House Speaker Madigan, kind of pulled the strings with recommending jobs at Metra. If you remember the scandal back, almost a decade ago now. And so, now that's a couple, 3 reports that inspector generals have not been able to publish. The Bipartisan Legislative Ethics Commission has apparently prevented the publishing of those reports. And it plays into the long-running narrative, whether it's true or false or exaggerated or, made into a cartoon, that Illinois lawmakers are corrupt and they don't want to be governed.
Jerry, that's and notwithstanding some of what was accomplished with ethics legislation this year, I guess my thought had been, maybe some other people too, that following this scandal, which we always tend to see ethics legislation approved after a big scandal, after the one that's still ongoing, the ComEd bribery scheme, that we thought there might be more coming. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, it is. But the other thing to remember about that is the actions that ComEd and Luis Arroyo, who was also indicted, what they were doing was already illegal. So they're breaking the laws that already exist. And, we maybe thought there would be more bite to the ethics bills that passed, but, it's a situation where bad actors are probably going to try to find a way to circumvent whatever laws are on the books in one way or another. So we'll see if this has any level of actually being a detriment to that type of action, or if it's more of another roadblock that people are going to try to get around.
Yeah, Charlie, get your thoughts on that as somebody who has seen lots of scandals through the years in state government and some incremental movement on ethics. Your thoughts on that as well.
Oh, I think we'll continue to see legislation. What are the things, for example, that the ethics law that's waiting Governor Pritzker's action puts a sort of a close on the revolving door. It says that the person who's leaving the legislature has to wait 6 months before getting some outside job as a consultant. And people are saying, well, that's not long enough. It should be at least 2 years. And that's probably so. But before this legislation, there was no prohibition on a lawmaker resigning today and getting a lobbying job tomorrow. So as I said earlier, it's all sort of incremental, and we'll keep seeing this moving along. And I can give you kind of an analogous situation. When I started as a reporter many years ago, the legislative pay was given out on the first day of the legislative session in January of the odd numbered year, and they were given the full legislative salary for the full 2-year term. And that finally got adjusted to where they were paid a month at a time. And now this year, after a lot of complaints by Comptroller Susanna Mendoza and others, it's now finally to the point where you get paid every month. And if you quit in the middle of a month, you get prorated. You don't get the whole month. You only get however many days you worked in the month. So that's an example of reforms over time. And I think we're going to see the same stuff with this area of ethics. And to me, the most important thing is that there is more disclosure so that you know what and the financial interests are of a lawmaker. And then the voters can decide for themselves, is this person behaving ethically when he voted on this legislation that benefits himself? It's probably easier to expose what's going on than it is to try and figure out how can we legislate against every possible impropriety.
Well, quickly, there was a ruling from the Federal Elections Commission this week regarding Robin Kelly, chair of the Democratic Party of Illinois. She is also a congresswoman, and what the ruling basically said is there's a lot she cannot do when it comes to raising money. Hannah, your take on that, what does it mean for the Democratic Party going forward?
Right. It's kind of interesting, and I don't really know where this came from, I confess, but there is a weird prohibition on, there's separate what is called soft money is for state legislative races. Hard money is for federal races. Don't ask me why they're called these things. But, as a sitting congresswoman, Robin Kelly can't actually raise state soft money, which the Federal Election Commission finally came out with that opinion this week after she was, voted into the chair of the Democratic Party of Illinois in February to replace Madigan. And, what does this mean? I mean, I think that we've already seen a lot of division since that ruling. I mean, we knew that once Madigan left, we would see natural divisions in his wake. There's a power vacuum to be filled. But, for example, House Speaker Chris Welch has already said that he's not going to serve on the committee that's supposed to, be in charge of raising that soft money within DPI, as Robin Kelly's kind of figurehead. He's not going to do it. And so we will see what happens there. It's difficult because, Governor Pritzker has a lot of money, but there's kind of some sour grapes because if you remember, he was backing Alderwoman Michelle Harris to be DPI chair, and Dick Durbin muscled through Robin Kelly, and here's where we're at. The IPC says, actually, no, she pretty much can't do her job. So.
Just a couple of seconds here. Hannah, real quick, because you reported on this week, we heard Governor Pritzker at the start of the show say that the pandemic, wanted to remind everybody it's still going. We're seeing the Delta variant, more cases starting to pop up in some areas. Some locations are not very well vaccinated in parts of Illinois. We just saw also in parts of California where they're going to return to an indoor mask mandate. It doesn't appear as though the governor is heading in that direction anytime soon.
That's right. LA County this week said that regardless of vaccination status, we're going to go back to masking indoors. But, the governor, he's taken a lot of arrows, and I, spoke to his office this week, and they said, no, unless things get, drastically bad, we're not looking at mitigation. And, that makes sense for a lot of political reasons. Just people have been at the end of their rope, so we will see what happens there.
Okay, it's time for our notes from the field. And Jerry, let's start with you.
Yeah, so there are 2 lawsuits challenging the legislative maps drawn by Democrats and recently passed in May. They've been consolidated into one case before a 3-judge panel The lawsuits are from the Republican legislative leaders and the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. And they contend that American Community Survey data, instead of census data that was used to draw the maps, runs afoul of the U.S. Constitution. That's going to be set for a September trial, the end of September. So, but the census data is set to come out in August. So it'll be interesting to see if there are any changes to those maps or any other developments in that area before that trial.
Okay, Hannah.
Right. Well, actually, Jerry wrote a really good story on the state of our unemployment trust fund in Illinois, the money from which unemployment benefits are paid out of and businesses pay into via taxes. But the pandemic was so dire that we ran that fund dry and then some. And now we're approaching a $5 billion deficit. But reporting I did last week, revealed that we had a chance to, save on some of that money by implementing what's called a work share program, which is popular in Europe and some other states. This is a law that we had on the books since 2014, but the Rather administration never implemented it. Pritzker administration never did. It allows employers to avoid mass layoffs by instead just reducing their workers' hours and letting them collect prorated unemployment benefits. And during the beginning of the pandemic, Congress allowed states to implement temporary work share programs. Illinois never did, and as a result, we have missed out on a lot of things, from matching unemployment benefits that would have been reimbursed by the federal government to these folks who could have been on that program. They could have also collected enhanced unemployment benefits, and communities could have benefited. There's a lot of missed opportunities, and that's kind of a lot of the story of Illinois.
All right, and Charlie.
Well, for years, we've heard what a rotten place Illinois is to do business. It's been a constant drumbeat from some editorial boards, some pseudo think tanks. Even former Governor Bruce Rauner would harp on how terrible Illinois is as a place to do business. Well, apparently not everybody shares that thought. CNBC every couple of years does an analysis of which are the best states for businesses. And in the one that came out last week, Illinois was ranked 15th among all the states. And we ranked more highly than all of our neighbors, higher than Indiana, Iowa, Wisconsin, Missouri, Kentucky. And we were rated number 1 in terms of infrastructure. So I guess either with the departure of Bruce Rauner and the advent of J.B. Pritzker, the state has suddenly miraculously gotten a lot better. Or maybe the people who badmouthed Illinois for all those years, maybe their criticism was not valid.
All right, that's all the time we have for this episode of State Week. Our panel included Charlie Wheeler, Hannah Meisel, and Jerry Nowicki with Capital News Illinois. You can get a podcast of our show available at nprillinois.org, through the NPR One app or iTunes, and join us next time. I'm Sean Crawford.
You've been listening to State Week, a program of commentary and analysis of events in Illinois state politics and government. State Week is produced in the state capital by public radio station NPR Illinois. This is IPR, Illinois Public Radio.